Hello everybody and welcome to today's live and ticking event. Thank you so much for joining us. We're delighted that you're here and fantastic to do events like this virtually as well so more people can join us. I'm Kerry Smith. I'm Director of People and Organisational Development for the British Heart Foundation and delighted to be your host today. This event today is part of a series of live and ticking events. Last month, in fact, we had a fantastic event on the condition called vascular dementia. It gives us a great opportunity to share with you the latest BHF news and in particular to give you a chance to meet some of our pioneering BHF-funded researchers, which we're delighted to share with you and some of the work that they do. This particular event is recorded, so if you're watching this back, we have recorded it, and it means that more people can get to see it, even if you weren't able to join us when it's live at this time. We encourage you to ask questions, so please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and we'll be coming to those after you've heard from our speakers today. Before we start though, I just wanted to pay tribute to His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. You may or may not be aware that Prince Philip has been our patron for quite a considerable time, and we are deeply, deeply saddened by the death of Prince Philip, His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. And just to recognise the fact really that he has given us steadfast support since the British Heart Foundation was established. So we're coming up to 60, it's our 60th year, and Prince Philip was there right at the beginning and has been our patron for all that time and has continued over that extended time to be really showcasing and supporting all that we do with our BHF research. So his contribution, whilst not just to us, to many charities, will be forever remembered. So turning to today's event, this month we are honoured to be joined by Professor Nishi Chaturvedi, who is Professor of Clinical Epidemiology at the University College London. Professor Chaturvedi's research considered how ethnicity and inequalities influence both the risk and care of heart and circulatory diseases. We're also delighted to be joined by Hina Shah and Carol Igafosy, who will be sharing their personal experience actually, of heart disease as well. And we're delighted that they're able to join us today. So thank you both for joining us. So just to give a little bit of context to the what you're going to hear today, really. Today, as we sit here today, there are more than 7 million people in the UK that are living with heart and circulatory diseases. Many millions more also have those risk factors, such as high blood pressure, raised cholesterol, obesity, or type 2 diabetes, risk factors which then impact on heart and circulatory disease. But research has shown that there is a strong link with heart and circulatory disease and health inequalities. And these are often described as differences in people's health status, for example, life expectancy. But the term health inequalities also refers to the differences in healthcare that people receive and the opportunities they have to lead healthy lives. And these differences are both unfair and avoidable. We know that socioeconomic status is a powerful indicator of premature mortality. For example, people living in England's most deprived areas are more than 3 times more likely to die from cardiovascular disease than those living in least deprived areas. Likewise, there are recognised disparities in cardiovascular risk factors between people from different ethnicities living in the UK. So, for example, people with Black African, African Caribbean, and South Asian ethnic backgrounds are more likely to develop type 2 diabetes at an earlier age, and even if they have a lower BMI, than the rest of the UK population. And this increases their risk of stroke and heart attack as well. Health inequalities can be influenced by many factors such as income, housing, environment, education, and access to health and social care. But they are not inevitable. And with concerted effort from national governments, local initiatives, charities such as the BHF, we can actually close that unfair gap in cardiovascular health. And at the BHF, we recognise what an important part we have to play in this. I've mentioned our BHF research going back 60 years. It is a very long history of BHF research, and we have been supporting research into health inequalities for some considerable time. For example, we have part-funded the Whitehall 11 study for over 20 years, which is one of the longest running and most significant studies of social inequity and chronic disease globally. We've also part-funded the Southall and Brent Revisited study, which involves nearly 5,000 participants and is examining ethnic differences in cardiometabolic risk. This study, in fact, is led by today's first speaker, Professor Nishi Chaturvedi. We also, as well as our research, we look at community health programs and how we can work with different populations in communities to help raise awareness and lower the risk factors that are associated with heart disease. And additionally, we look at how we can influence the government, how we can influence senior leaders in the NHS as well, to be making sure that we are looking and taking care of and being much more aware of the health inequalities that exist. So whilst we are doing many things from many different aspects, there is so much more to be done, and we want longer, better lives for everyone. Action to reduce inequalities is in heart and circulatory diseases lies at the centre of our mission and our strategy to 2030. So very keen to give you that little bit of context, but now very keen to hand you over to Professor Chaturvedi, who will give you some more information on the very important research that she has been doing at the BHF. So over to you, Nish.
Thank you, Kerry, for that introduction. It's a pleasure and privilege to be speaking to your audience here today. Since the very beginning of my career, the British Heart Foundation has been an important funder of my research. And I'm going to share with you some of our findings on inequalities, particularly ethnic inequalities. But I'm going to start by showing you this very familiar tube map of London. Against the stations, the researchers, these were based at UCL, not from my group, but from another group, have also indicated life expectancy for those people who live around those areas that are denoted by the tube stations. And I've highlighted two tube stations in particular. Green Park here, which covers a relatively affluent area of London with a life expectancy of 89 years. And compare that to Whitechapel at 78 years. In the East End of London, a relatively deprived part of London. These stations are only a few miles apart, but as you can see, there's a 10-year difference in life expectancy, and much of that is driven by cardiovascular disease, heart attack, and stroke. To put that into context, the difference in life expectancy between Western developed nations and sub-Saharan Africa is around 15 to 20 years. So this is a substantial difference, and you don't have to cross the continent to see this difference. So we're going to go to our first poll. This is an opportunity for you to get involved and answer a key question around inequalities and health. I'm assuming that the poll is being shown. Yes, that's great. So the question is, what is the main explanation for the lower life expectancy in poorer parts of London compared to the more affluent parts? In other words, what explains the poorer life expectancy in Whitechapel compared to Green Park? Is it genes, health behaviours, access to healthcare, or others, or don't know? And please go ahead and vote and choose one of these options, and we'll give you a few seconds to do so. Okay, so we've got some interesting findings here. The most important factor that people have identified, by far and away more important than anything else, is health behaviours, smoking, diet and exercise, followed by access to healthcare. So I'm going to touch on those a bit later on, but in particular, I want to talk about, some of the explanations that you've raised, particularly around health behaviours. So these are some photographs that have been taken around Green Park, the affluent area, and around Whitechapel, a deprived area. And what this shows is that around Green Park, there are a number of large parks where you can go and exercise in a safe environment. We don't have those in Whitechapel. Further, the availability of healthy, fresh foodstuffs is much more frequent in areas, in affluent areas, than in deprived areas, which are largely served by fast food outlets. Quality of housing much better in affluent areas than in deprived areas. So these are infrastructural explanations for inequalities in health. It is much easier to take exercise and to shop for healthy foodstuffs in the more affluent areas, and much more tempting to not take exercise and to eat unhealthy fast foodstuffs in the more deprived areas. And if you were born in these areas, then those healthy lifestyles are established at quite a young age and quite hard to shake off as you get older. So for sure, the choices you make are your individual choices, but they are driven by the area around you. So I'm going to ask the same question. Now, if we could have the next poll, we're going to talk about ethnic differences in cardiovascular risk. As Kerry said in her introduction, people of South Asian descent, these are people who have migrated to the UK from the Indian subcontinent, and people of Caribbean descent or African descent are much more likely to have higher risks of cardiovascular disease, this includes heart attack and stroke, than the general population. This is about a 1.5 to 2-fold excess. So what explains this? Is it genes, health behaviours, access to healthcare, other, don't know? So while the question is different, the options are the same as the previous poll. So please go ahead and vote now, and we'll give you a few seconds to do so. Okay, so different sets of responses to the previous question, again, though, health behaviours taking the lead, but followed closely by genetic explanations and then access to healthcare. Okay, so let's take some of those explanations in turn. I'm going to look at some risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And as Kerry said in her introduction, risk factors such as smoking, cholesterol, blood pressure tend to sort of lead the pack in terms of explanations for why some people get heart disease and some people don't. So when we compare people of South Asian descent or people of African Caribbean descent to those of European descent and look at smoking patterns, cholesterol and blood pressure, what we find is quite interesting, that South Asians and African Caribbeans are less likely to smoke than Europeans. And total cholesterol is lower in South Asians and in African Caribbeans than Europeans. This is the amount of total fat that's circulating in your body. Blood pressure, at least in youth and middle age, appears to be lower in South Asians than Europeans. And the only anomaly here is that African Caribbeans do in fact have higher blood pressures throughout life than Europeans, and that might begin to contribute to excess risks of cardiovascular disease. But it's important to note that two of the key leading risk factors are actually favorable in South Asians and African Caribbeans. What is, however, adverse, though, and again, Kerry mentioned this in her introduction, is diabetes. Diabetes risks are about 4-fold higher in South Asians compared to Europeans, and 3-fold higher in African Caribbeans compared to Europeans. And this is associated with ethnic differences in either total body fat or body fat distribution. So particularly in South Asians, body fat is more likely to be distributed around the waist, and that is particularly adverse in terms of your risk for cardiovascular disease, but also increases your risk of diabetes. So what explains the excess risks of diabetes and body fat distribution, excess body fat itself in these ethnic minority groups compared to Europeans? And oftentimes people do reach for a genetic explanation. Certainly researchers have looked very hard to find a genetic explanation for these ethnic differences. And there are genes that increase your risk of diabetes and that alter body fat distribution. So thinking about diabetes, there's around 100 genes that are associated with an increased risk of diabetes. But each of those contributes only a small, less than 1% of the risk of an individual getting diabetes. So when you combine all those genes, we can only account for about 5 to 6% of any given person's risk of diabetes. In other words, quite a small contribution. Further, when people have looked at these genes in different ethnic groups, they can't find a different distribution of these genes or a different impact of these genes on risk. So far, we can't find a genetic explanation for ethnic differences in risk. And we've got to remember that ethnicity is not a biological construct. It's a social, cultural construct. Ethnicity is not biology. Environmental risk factors can impact biology, but that's not the same as saying that it is due to biology. To add a bit more evidence to what I'm saying here, we compared ethnic differences in diabetes by generation. So I'll take you through this slide. It's a little bit complex. The evidence that we've talked about, that Kerry has talked about and I've talked about thus far, is really referring to first-generation migrants to the UK, people who came over to the UK in the middle of the last century, in their 20s and 30s. So we have the first-generation South Asians here in the green compared to the Europeans, and you can see about a 4-fold excess risk of diabetes in these first-generation migrants compared to Europeans. Similarly, African Caribbeans, about a 3-fold excess of diabetes risk compared to Europeans. But we then looked at the risk of diabetes in second-generation migrants. These are offspring of the first generation. So these are people who are born and bred in this country. And what we see here is that the second-generation migrants, either of South Asian descent or of African Caribbean descent, have lower risks of diabetes than the first generation. Their genetic makeup hasn't changed that much, but what has changed is the environmental pressures. What we're seeing, if we look at now deprivation, this is people living in the lowest quintile, the lowest fifth of deprivation in the UK. Compared to Europeans, we can see that first-generation migrants of either South Asian or African Caribbean descent are much more likely to live in deprived areas than Europeans. that likelihood is attenuated somewhat in the second generation. The second generation ethnic minority individuals have become more affluent. And with that affluence, we see a reduction in total body fat distribution, and a reduction in diabetes risk. In other words, it seems to be that the affluence that we're seeing, the increasing affluence in these second generation migrants, is contributing to the lower risks of diabetes that we're seeing here. And what we see is a 20% reduction in diabetes in South Asians in the second generation, and a 30% reduction in African Caribbeans. This is a huge reduction. It's not trivial, and is driven by what you might think is quite a modest improvement in affluence. So affluence has a really huge impact in diabetes risk. And these percentages, you can see, are huge compared to the percentages I talked about, which are related to genetic influences on diabetes. I'm now going to move on and talk about access to healthcare, because some of you suggested access to healthcare was a key player in ethnic differences, inequalities in cardiovascular disease. Getting care for cardiovascular disease is a complex process and involves both the patient and the healthcare system. So, for example, if we're thinking about something like a heart attack, it requires the individual to recognize they're having an event, recognize that it's serious, choose to seek help, and to seek help immediately, and to accept the interventions offered. The doctor has to make the correct diagnosis, do the right tests, perform the right investigations, and provide the right treatments. And we do see some evidence that people from ethnic minorities do experience delays in getting appropriate health care. So the hypotheses that have been proposed are that people from ethnic minority groups perhaps don't recognize the importance of their symptoms, or that they delay seeking help, or perhaps once they've sought help, they're unwilling to accept medical or surgical interventions. From the practitioner side, it could be due to discrimination, or misdiagnosis, or inappropriate use of guidelines. And to touch on all of these explanations in more detail. So one of the studies we did was to send out a questionnaire to people of South Asian and European descent, middle-aged folk, and give them a vignette, a story of an individual walking upstairs carrying a heavy load and experiencing central chest pain, putting down the load and feeling a bit better, but concerned because they'd had that event before. And we asked our respondents, what do they think the pain is? Do they think it's serious? Would they seek help? Would they seek help immediately? And would they accept an intervention if it was offered? And overwhelmingly, the South Asians were equally likely to recognize that this pain was coming from the heart as the Europeans, and in fact, even more likely to wish to seek help urgently and to accept interventions, be them medical or surgical. Now, clearly intentions don't necessarily carry through to actions, but it's a good indicator of what people might do were they going to experience such an event. So that doesn't seem to be the explanation, or perhaps it does. We're going to hear some stories towards the end of this discussion from Pina and Carol, and you'll be able to hear their lived experience of heart disease. So when I was at medical school, we were taught how to spot someone having a heart attack. And the symptoms that you see on the left-hand side of the slide here are the kind of things we were taught to look out for: chest pain, shortness of breath, the pain radiating up to the jaw, the neck, or down the shoulder. So that's what we expect to see when someone's having a heart attack. But it's now clear that there are non-standard symptoms, things like dizziness, heartburn, cold sweat, unusual tiredness. And there's evidence to suggest that people with diabetes, women, and ethnic minorities are more likely to present with these non-standard symptoms. So if you present with non-standard symptoms, firstly, as an individual, you may not recognize that you're having a heart attack, because even messages to the general public emphasize these symptoms, and that your GP or the doctor in the hospital may also misdiagnose what's going on. And indeed, there's some evidence that South Asians are more likely to be referred to the gastrointestinal specialist, because the symptoms they're describing sound like heartburn, and require that specialist rather than the cardiologist. It could also explain why there are delays in getting treatment, because disease is being misdiagnosed. To turn now to guidelines. So the GP that you see, when they're thinking about your risk of cardiovascular disease, will take all of your risk factors into consideration and put them into an algorithm that works out, given your level of smoking or cholesterol or blood pressure or diabetes, what are your future risks of cardiovascular disease? And if it's over a certain threshold, they will prescribe you treatments to prevent cardiovascular disease, things like statins, for example. These guidelines have largely been developed and deployed in people of white European origin, and may not work so well in people of South Asian and African Caribbean origin, where, as you can see, the constellation and interplay of risk factors is very different. Those guidelines do try and take account of different ethnicities, but our work suggests that they don't do it particularly well, and that perhaps some ethnic minority groups are being undertreated. So to summarize then, when we're talking about inequalities in heart disease and stroke, the impact of inequalities is large and it's graded. So in other words, it's not just the lowest 20% of the population being particularly adversely affected and everyone else being fine. There is a graded relationship between affluence and risk of heart disease and stroke. So it affects us all. And these inequalities act throughout life. As you can see, health behaviors are set at birth or from birth throughout life, and are due to not only just individual choices, but your environment that helps us, guides us as to what we should be doing. In terms of healthcare, the standard symptoms and guidelines might miss diversity in expression of symptoms, and might miss diversity in risks of cardiovascular disease, the interplay of different risk factors. And I would argue, and it's a point for discussion, that the solutions to address inequalities in cardiovascular disease are more societal than individual. I'm going to end by acknowledging my fellow researchers, Therese Tillen and Sophie Eastwood, the people who take part in research. And it's really important that people who have taken part in our SABRE study and other studies have volunteered their time for free to help us with the kind of understanding that I'm sharing with you here. And I particularly want to thank the funders and the British Heart Foundation in particular, which has funded a lot of our research. So thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to the questions, but first we're going to hear some stories from patients. Over to you, Kerry.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Nish. That was really inspiring and really insightful to understand those contributing factors, really, that dispel some of the kind of thoughts and myths around some of that too. So thank you. It's really great research that you're doing, and love to hear a little bit more from our supporters in terms of the questions I'd like to put to you. But before we do, I'd like to introduce Hina Shah, who's going to give us some personal insight into her experience of heart and circulatory disease. So over to you, Hina.
Thank you. Firstly, can I just check that you can hear and see me okay?
We can.
Thank you very much. Okay, so my story goes back to November 2007. It was a busy Saturday morning in November, and it was the last weekend before Diwali. I was really excited. I had lots to prepare, and I was really enjoying making Diwali sweets with my 5-year-old daughter. Suddenly, as I was going about busy in the kitchen, I felt as if I was choking. I couldn't breathe easily, and my throat felt as if it was constricting. It didn't make any sense because I hadn't eaten anything for a good few hours by then. It was really odd. I was in my 30s at that time and had a perfectly normal, busy lifestyle. I was working in a busy job and I was looking after my family with my two young children. Okay, so I admit I didn't proactively practice self-care and I didn't prioritize exercise, but in the list of priorities for a busy working a parent, that usually is quite low on the priority list. So I was still experiencing this choking sensation and it wasn't going away. So I decided that the next best thing for me to do was to try and lie down and hopefully it would pass. So going back to what Dr. Chaturvedi said, I downplayed my symptoms. I didn't know I was experiencing a heart event. I lay down, but luckily for me, my 5-year-old daughter followed me up and she realized I was looking very unwell. So I managed to whisper to her to go downstairs and get help. She went downstairs and dragged her granddad, that's my father-in-law, to come up with her. So holding her hand, he came up and he was shocked to see me lying on my bed looking helpless, whereas 5-10 minutes earlier, I'd been looking perfectly fine, carrying on in the kitchen. He dialed 999 and within minutes, the ambulance was at our doorstep. The paramedics who came to see me were bewildered. It was really odd. My blood pressure was dropping. I seemed to be passing in and out of consciousness. They asked my family questions about my health and previous health conditions. And they noted that I didn't smoke, I wasn't overweight, I had a good, healthy diet. I used to walk and, sort of was fairly active in my lifestyle. Things didn't quite add up. They took me down into the ambulance and they did an ECG and they conferred amongst themselves. My husband tells me this afterwards. They did another ECG. Things weren't quite adding up. They whispered to my husband, "We suspect something's wrong with your wife's heart. We would like to take her in for a checkup." So I should mention here that I didn't have chest pain, or I didn't have the left arm hurting or nausea or anything other than a constriction in my throat. I had not suspected that I was having a heart event. So I remember as I was going through the ambulance, I remember praying and willing myself to remain calm. I had two young children and I had to get through this. I wanted to see them grow up. The cardiac team at the hospital was amazing. Within minutes, I was on the operating table and they were putting 2 stents in my left anterior descending artery. I didn't know what stents was, by the way, at that time. After that, my recovery process began. This was long and at times frustrating. It took about 8 weeks for me to recover. I went for cardiac rehab at the hospital, and I extensively used British Heart Foundation resources. To name a few, I called the nurse and found out about terms that were all alien to me and I had to quickly get familiar with. I also use their booklets and resources a lot to learn more about heart disease and my lifestyle going forward. After about 8 weeks, I returned to work and slowly my confidence increased to begin to live a normal life. Years have passed on. In December 2020, through the coronavirus lockdown, through that year, I had been increasing my exercise regime. And in December, I felt the same constriction in my throat again. I was scared, this time for a different reason. I was scared to go to the hospital because of everything I was hearing about COVID. However, I pushed myself to give a call to the GP and she urged me to go to A&E immediately. I can't thank her enough. I had suffered another minor heart episode and going to the hospital and getting treatment again saved my life. I now have a loop recorder and that monitors my heart rate because this time round they'd found that my pulse had dropped significantly. I'm 4 months on, I'm now back to my normal life. but I'm much more mindful not to exert my exercise regime excessively. I'd like to end here by saying that as Dr. Chaturvedi presented, I had two of the factors. I'm of an ethnic minority and a woman, and I did not have the typical symptoms of a heart attack. I was very lucky and very grateful that the paramedics, as well as the cardiac team in the hospital, were able to diagnose my condition quickly and provide me with the correct treatment. So I'm really appreciative of the British Heart Foundation and the research that they lead, as well as Dr. Chaturvedi and other researchers who help bring hope and solutions for people with conditions like mine. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Hina. That's so interesting to get your personal perspective, and also to hear how much the BHF research and resources really helped you in that situation and when you needed it most. I'd like to, now to hand you over to Carol Igafosi, who's going to give her account as well of your experiences with heart and circulatory diseases. So over to you, Carol.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Good afternoon, everybody. I am very honored to be asked to share my story. It was very interesting listening to Nishi's research findings. So I am speaking from the perspective of a patient, but I'm also a GP. So I've got a doctor's head on with all of this. In 2018, the 22nd of January to be precise, I went to work. I did a triage shift, telephone consultation shift in the morning, and I was meant to finish my shift around about 12:30. Just before I finished, probably about 15 minutes or so, I realized that I had what I thought was indigestion symptoms. And I had not eaten that day because I was fasting for religious reasons. I'm a Christian and we sometimes fast. Sometimes when I fast, I do get a little bit of indigestion symptoms. And so that didn't mean anything to me. I just said to myself, I'll eat as soon as I get home, because I was meant to do another shift in the evening. So I left work probably about 1:45, because I was chatting a little bit with my colleague who was taking over. And I got in my car and started driving home, of course, not thinking anything about heart problem. I called my husband to let him know I was on my way home. And I also remembered that one of my friends, who happens to be a GP trainee at the time, wanted to talk to me. She had worked a night shift, but instead of going to bed, she stayed up because she wanted to talk to me. So as soon as I got in the car, I decided I would call her using the hands-free Bluetooth system. And as I was talking to her, I realized that the indigestion symptoms had not settled. And I just said to her, Trace, you know, I don't usually get chest pain, but this discomfort in my chest that I've been experiencing is not shifting. And so she went into doctor's mode and started asking me all the questions about, you know, what the pain is like, how would I grade it, how would I describe it, all those sorts of things. But we chatted for a while and then came to the conclusion that it doesn't quite make sense, it doesn't add up, but if it continues, I would go and get it checked out at the GP at a later time. At this time, even though we were thinking heart, and she did ask all of the heart things, it just didn't add up because, again, thinking about the risk factors, I wasn't overweight, I wasn't diabetic, I didn't have high blood pressure, my cholesterol was normal, I did my exercises every morning before I go to work. It just didn't feature. As we continued talking further down the road, I realized that I couldn't concentrate on what she was saying. And this discomfort was now becoming more of a chest pain. So I said to her, this is not right, I need to pull over. She said, pull over, I'll call 999. I pulled over, she called 999. And after that, I realized that I was getting sort of textbook chest pain, central crushing symptoms. And also I began to feel a little bit disoriented, confused. I began to feel sweaty, etc. I wanted to lower the car window down to get some fresh air, and I just couldn't work out how to do that. And by this time, I'm thinking, where are the paramedics? So I called 999 as well. And at this time, in my head, I realized I'm having a heart attack. Can't explain, but I knew this sounded like a heart attack and felt like what I've read in the textbook about a heart attack. So I told the call advisor that I am a doctor and I believe I'm having a heart attack. The paramedics eventually came and told us around 10 minutes, felt like an eternity. But in my head, I'm having a heart attack. So I expect when they came that they would be like, you know, on a mission, urgent. But they were quite lackadaisical, quite, you know, jolly chant and, you know, saunter just come. And they parked the ambulance a little way down from where my car was, and then came to me and got me to secure my car, i.e. wind up the windows, etc., and then walked to the ambulance from where my car was. And I don't know how I did all of that because I was in a disoriented state. And that in itself told me, these people aren't taking me serious. If you've got a heart attack, you don't want the patient to walk, you want the patient to rest as much as possible. But I managed to do it. We got in the ambulance and they started. And by the way, whilst we were walking towards the ambulance, I repeated to the paramedic, I am a doctor, I do believe I'm having a heart attack. And he just looked at me and said, oh, you doctors always think of the worst. When we got in the ambulance, they did start the correct treatment for heart attack. So they did give me an aspirin. They started putting a venflon in my vein to access, for venous access, so I could get fluids, etc. And I was by this time having crushing central textbook chest pain, 10 out of 10. And so I was given morphine. I was very nauseous, so I was given anti-sickness medicines. And they did an ECG and all of that. Now, if I were a GP having me as a patient in front of me, I would want the patient to go to the heart specialist hospital, which we have in Leicester, where I'm from. So I asked them to take me there, but I know the protocols. They had to do what they had to do and then discuss it with the doctors there, and the decision would be made. And of course, when they discussed it with the practitioners at the hospital, based on who they had in front of them, who I looked, what I, you know, all the history Hina mentioned, you know, all the risk factors, nothing just didn't add up. And my ECG was certainly not adding up. What they said they found was what we call a high takeoff in medicine. Now that could be the first sign of a heart attack, but it could also be a normal variant for an ethnic minority person. And so it was all dismissed as something else, not explained, but not heart. So instead of taking me to Glenfield Hospital, I was taken to the hospital, which is nearby. It was just about 5 minutes away. And to cut a long story short, unfortunately, I went to that hospital, waited there for 14 hours. Even though I was constantly in pain, they had to keep giving me morphine, etc. I had other painkillers because at one point I couldn't tolerate the morphine. And it wasn't until about 4 o'clock in the morning, the following morning, that I was blue lighted to the Glenfield Hospital where I wanted to go in the first place. And having got there, it was confirmed that I did have a heart attack. And I don't know if we've got sort of two types, like where there is partial blockage and total blockage. I had a total blockage of my left anterior descending artery. And 6 hours after arriving at Glenfield, yet another 6 hours before I had my stent. So a total of 20 hours after I had the initial symptom and recognized. The following day, I had an ultrasound of my heart and echocardiogram, which showed that unfortunately I'd suffered significant damage to the left ventricle of my heart. And the ejection fraction, which is the amount of blood that the heart is able to pump out with each drug. So the fraction of how much is pumped out. Usually we need about 65% of blood perfuse all our body. Mine was pumping out 18%. So as a doctor, when I heard that, I started crying, because for me, that meant heart failure and a life of a different life, basically. That's now improved to 35%, but that's still quite low. And I'm still contemplating whether to have an ICD, so cardiovascular defibrillator, put in. And basically my life has changed. I am now living with a diagnosis of heart failure. I am not symptomatic in the sense that I don't have a lot of shortness of breath, etc., etc. And I'm hoping that I will remain generally quite well. I'm on a cocktail of medications. I'm still quite ardent with my lifestyle things, my exercise, my diet, etc. But suffice it to say, my life has changed. But I'm grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to be sharing my story. And I hope that women in particular and people of ethnic minority and whoever, you know your body. If you think something is different, I always say, be nice, be polite, but please insist, because we know when something is not right with us. Thanks for listening.
Carol, thank you so much, and thank you for your honesty. It's so fantastic to share your story, and the same to you, Hina, because we learn so much from these stories, and it's a very important message to so many people. So thank you for taking time to do that today. I would really like to hear from some people in the audience if we've got any questions that they would like to put to anybody that's been speaking today. So Christy, I think you have some questions that have come through. Would you like to take us through those?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kerry. We've had some fantastic questions come through. So thanks to the audience for submitting them and for posting them live today as well. So my first question is for Nish, and it's from Amanda. So thank you, Amanda. Is there one particular ethnicity that is most at risk of poor cardiovascular health in comparison to others?
So this is quite a complex question, and thank you for it. So we talk about ethnic minorities often in one breath, but actually their experience of cardiovascular disease is different. So people of South Asian descent have both excess risks of heart attack and of stroke than white Europeans. People of Black African descent also share that excess risk of stroke, but actually appear to have lower risks of heart disease, at least in the general population, than white Europeans. But as Carol pointed out, risks of heart failure are indeed higher. So once you get down to the individual components of cardiovascular disease, there are nuanced but quite important differences, ethnic differences in those outcomes. And whereas the two ethnic groups I've talked about do share an excess risk of diabetes, the other risk factors are distributed perhaps a little bit differently. So each group needs to be considered by itself to work out what's going on and how best we can prevent disease in these groups.
Great, thank you, Nish. And we have another question in from Tamara, which is, my anthropology research shows socioeconomic factors and inequalities affect health profiles, whereas genetic causes are irrelevant. In UK, almost impossible to assess. Does your research show the same trends? And I know you've touched on this slightly, Nish, but if you could expand, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in large part the message of what I wanted to say. And in particular, when we're thinking about ethnic minority groups, people do often reach for a genetic explanation as perhaps the sole explanation for differences. And that's worrying, because if we believe that, then a lot of people think, well, we can't do much to alter someone's genetic makeup, so there's nothing we can do. Whereas if we're really thinking about health behaviors and lifestyles and inequalities, there's an awful lot we can do to resolve those inequalities and ensure that everyone experiences the risks of heart disease that the most affluent of our population do. So I would agree with you that in large part, I think it's driven by inequalities, by the impacts that those have on health behaviors, and has very little, a small amount, but very little to do with genetics. There are some rare genetic disorders that are associated with cardiovascular disease, and the BHF do support that research. But in large part, for the whole population, it's about health behaviors, it's about inequalities.
Thank you, Nish. Our next question is for Kerry. And thank you, Paula, for submitting this question. How can the BHF work towards or influence the factors that bring about health inequalities?
Yes, thank you. Great question. And many of the things I talked about at the beginning actually are what we are doing and continue to do. But I think a lot of it is about awareness. So, you know, just as we've got greater understanding and awareness now from the presentations that we've heard today, it's about how the BHF can increase that awareness, looking for the signs for, you know, a heart attack, for example, but also for all the research that we do. So as I mentioned before, we do you know, a high amount of research into this area. In fact, over recent years, we've put £15.7 million worth of research into health inequalities over the years. This is quite generic. It's research that includes things such as social determinants of health, like education and employment, but also research into health-related practices and outcomes related to different ethnic groups. So we are proud of the research that we're doing, but we want to do more, obviously. And obviously the work we're doing on communities and that influencing is very important to us as well, that we want to keep all of that high on the agenda and keep that high in the government's mind and senior leaders in the NHS too.
Great, thank you, Kerry. Great, so our next question, I'll start off with Nish, but I'd love Carolyn and Hina to add to this question. So within ethnicity, is there difference or evidence of different treatments and outcomes between genders? And this is a question from Malvina.
So yes, it'd be great to hear from Carol and Hina how their experiences have helped us inform their thinking about this. But certainly, I talked a little bit about guidelines and how risk factors, such as smoking, cholesterol, diabetes, and so on, are used in constellation to determine an individual's risk and therefore offer treatment to prevent heart disease. And our research has shown that South Asian women in particular are far less likely to get these treatments than they should do. In other words, they are markedly more disadvantaged than any other group in getting these preventive treatments. And for sure, that must have an impact. I think Carol and Hina can say an awful lot more about how misrecognition of their symptoms and delays has impacted on their health. So I'll hand over to both of those. So, perhaps Hina, you'd like to go first, yeah.
Thank you. So I think I was on the lucky side, especially having heard Carol's story. I feel even more fortunate that I was diagnosed very quickly on both occasions, and my symptoms, you know, were diagnosed correctly. I'll say one thing in terms of medication. When I've received certain types of statins, I found that I sometimes experience more severe side effects. I was recently put on a statin called rosuvastatin, and I suffered a lot more severe side effects than were perhaps listed in the leaflet. And then when I spoke to my GP, they did say that people of Southeast Asian origin can potentially have different side effects. And so I think it maybe more work needs to be done on that side as well, to see who tolerates what and all of that. So that's what I like to say, that perhaps there's room for additional research there.
In terms of risk factors, it is true that we know a lot from, you know, researches like you do, Nish, and other researches that have been done over the years. But it's also clear that we don't know everything. There are certain boxes that aren't ticked. For example, when I did at 40, when I had my NHS health checkup done, and when I had done my own personal risk factor, the result was that I could expect to live well into my 80s without having a heart attack or a stroke, because nothing that I put in the risk calculator there wasn't anything to put in there. Like I said, I didn't have high blood pressure, I had diabetes, etc. I didn't fit, but yet I had a heart attack at age 48. I think looking back, from personally, of course, I'm a busy GP, and my life is generally, from that perspective, stressful, and there are other stresses. So I think that stress does play an important role. Stress is not listed as an independent risk factor for heart attacks, but it's listed more as an association. I personally feel that some more work needs to be done on that. I don't know how we would quantify it, for example, but I do believe that stress has a big role to play, not just the indirect way where somebody's stressed and drinks more alcohol and smokes more, because that didn't apply to me. But I do think in terms of the inflammatory response in our bodies, etc., that does play more role. And I would love to see more research in that area. Other things like having had high blood pressure during pregnancy. I had in both my pregnancies, pregnancy-induced hypertension. I recovered from that as soon as I gave birth to my children, and I'm still not hypertensive. But looking back, I have discussed and I've wondered whether that played any role at all. And since I had the heart attack, I have been struggling with getting my blood glucose level back to normal. And looking back in my records, it was a little bit above normal from before. So at the moment, I'm classed as being at risk of diabetes, even though I've not been diagnosed. It did go up to 6.5, my HbA1c, I think it went up to 6.7 shortly after I had the heart attack, which is normal response, stress response, but I'm still struggling to get it below 6. At the moment, it's sitting at 6. I've lost even more weight. My lifestyle is, I don't know what more I can do, but those things. And just one other thing, sleep, I think, is a very big thing. Or sleep pattern. As a doctor, again, worked over the years, shift patterns, all of those things. My sleep was all over the place, and I'm still somebody who doesn't have a very good sleep pattern, but I do think that those things impact, and we don't talk about those a lot. I think more needs to be done, generally.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah.
Great. And our last question is for Kerry before we wrap up, which is a question that states, are our shops reopening?
Our shops have opened. We've still got a few more shops to open in Scotland and Northern Ireland in line with the regulations. But majority of our shops and all of our shops across England have opened on the 12th of April, and we are delighted. It was a bit of a big bang reopening. So that's the good news, because our shops are a very big contributor to the income that we need to fund our research. So if anybody's got any stock you want to donate because you've been saving it up in lockdown, or actually you would like to gain some new skills, meet some new people and come and volunteer for us in one of our stores, please get in touch either with your local store or through our website, because we'd love to hear from you. We welcome all the support we can get, so thank you very much. So I'd just like to close now, that we have a couple of quick polls we want to put to you. The first one is whether you think that we have increased your understanding of health inequalities related to heart and circulatory diseases. So one not at all, or 5 very much. Would you like to just complete that one for me now? Thank you. There we go. Oh, that's great to see. Lovely. That's really good. Thank you so much. And the second poll is, we'd really like to understand your likelihood of supporting the BHF. So has this event increased your likelihood to support the BHF in any way? So that's just a yes, no, or a maybe. And that just helps us to understand what we can do for you going forwards as well. Oh, fantastic. That's a resounding yes and a little bit of a maybe. So thank you very much for that. That's really good to know. So just to close the event, can I just once again say a really big thank you to Nishi, Professor Chaturvedi, for sharing the BHF research and insights with us. I'm sure you'll all agree that we've all learnt something very new today. and I certainly have found it very insightful and educational. But also a really big thank you to Hina and Carol for sharing so openly your stories today. They're tremendous to hear, and I think you alone are helping to raise awareness for everybody. So really appreciate you taking the time to support the BHF in this way and join this event today. And thank you so much. Thank you everybody for attending. I would encourage you to give us some feedback. We will be sending a questionnaire survey to your email that you registered with, so that it can help us to shape future events. And a reminder, the event is recorded so you can see it again or share it with friends and family. And the next event is on the 26th of May between 4 and 5 again. And the next one is going to be on mental health. So please do tell your friends and family and share with your networks. So do look out on the website, BHF/public events on our website to find out more information. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for joining us, and have a good evening. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.